Hello and welcome to Rule of Carnage, a podcast in which myself, Mike Hutchinson, and him, Glenn Ford, talk about designing better miniature games. Why are we qualified to talk about designing better miniature games, you ask? Well, check July's Tabletop Gaming magazine, in which you will find both of us represented in some form or other. I have got a potentially unplayable experimental miniature game, which I thought was rather good, but Glenn has found a couple of significant issues with. And here is Glenn Ford talking about The Happy Salmon, which is a game which he rather likes.
Yes, yeah, it's a fine party game. I mean, we talked about City of Glass on a previous Rule of Carnage. So if you're interested in it, look back a couple of episodes.
Watch more of our videos.
Watch more of our videos, like and subscribe to them, and you can see Mike bringing up the challenge within which he decided to write City of Glass rather than any of the things that I gave him to write, and onwards it goes. So, Mike, what is it that we were
tell me what to do?
You told me to tell you what to do.
Okay, little switcheroo there. So in the previous video, or if you are listening to us in a longer audio format, just one moment ago, we were talking about combat phases, and we were talking about some of the old standards and what you might do in terms of the basics of us constructing a combat phase. In this discussion, we are going to, I think, get a bit more effusive on what you can do to experiment with combat phases and push them and to pull them. And I think probably we'll talk about the many and varied attempts, successful and otherwise, that we've personally made to make interesting combat phases, because I think we've probably both written about 87 each at this point, and we'll talk about a small handful of those.
Insofar as I think I've largely given up on trying to make combat phases interesting and just dropping them out entirely for some other bizarre form of resolution. There might be an end point to it.
I'm still slightly obsessed with them, so yeah.
So okay, look,
yourself.
If you have two things bonking into each other and then you roll some dice and the thing that's bigger gets better dice and then bonks the other thing into the ground, and that's not a wildly interesting experience.
But can we just agree, at least having attempted to discuss a diceless resolution system or a no randomness resolution system, that we at least love the fact that you have to roll some dice and whether or not somebody gets bonked on the head is randomly determined. So there is goodness here, but yes, how do you make it better and more interesting and more novel?
I think certainly if that's the crunchies, it's a functional combat phase, whether it's shooting or close combat, is not inherently an interesting combat phase. And if you're writing your first ever combat phase, you might well reasonably be very satisfied with one that's functional. Certainly if you've written one out and then put it on the tabletop and then seen it collapse under its own weight and you've gone for a few iterations and you've gotten to the point of functionality, you might well think, Kalu Clay, Frabjous Day, that's what I'm putting out there.
That's right. We're here to crush your dreams.
We're here to tell you else. The truth of there are two truths here. One is there is a bunch of excellent games on the market.
Glenn Ford's throwing truth bombs out like
truth bombs into your brain. There are a bunch of excellent games out in the market, many of which, do the basic functionality of a combat phase has been covered well and covered splendidly, and it is already available. And even if it hadn't been, it has certain limitations to it. And so what you want to put some spice in there, you want to put a bit of interest in there, you want to make it so that there's some tactical crunch within your game and that people care about the combat phase and how it happens, where it happens, and it's all juicy.
And absolutely critically, which we talked about a lot in various other videos, is that it is appropriate and meaningful to the game material that you're trying to cover, like whatever the genre or the the core meat of what you're trying to communicate in this game. Like, make that, in many respects, like that resolution system can, like if done well, it can speak volumes about the sort of combat that you're trying to, the sort of environment, this narrative that you're trying to unfold.
Absolutely. And I'd say we were talking passing in the previous video about how historical combat games tend to do breakpoint resolutions within their combats, and that is something inherently makes combat quite interesting. It makes it a bit mathsy. It makes it a bit I know sometimes it can be convoluted, but it's inherently interesting going, okay, I need my ranks, I need my higher ground, I need my standard, I need to pre-calculate a certain number of these things. There's going to be some hidden stuff and malarkey going on, and then there's going to be some wounds that are going to shift it back and forth. But I've got to do a bit of pre-calculation, look for a flank, look for a rear. And that sort of breakpoint resolution is simulationist. It says a lot about the game, and it has built into it something that can be interesting. So we'll try and talk about some things that might make your other systems interesting. So I've got a few things noted down here that are worth considering to make your combat phase worthwhile. The quick one that turns up in a lot of systems is to have a, for want of a better term, rock paper scissors system.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not going to say that people look down upon the idea of that being the basis of your system. But it inherently makes things interesting. If thing X is good against thing Y, but not thing Z, then you're inherently, as soon as you put those things on the table, you've got a 2 to 3 dimensional puzzle. You care about whether thing X catches thing Y or gets caught by thing Z, and instantly, if you've got 5 things that have those relationships spread across them on a tabletop, that makes your combat phases interesting. It's simple, it's quick, it does a lot.
I suppose, just to play devil's advocate, does it make your combat phase interesting, or does it make the movement phase more interesting? Because in some regards, and I suppose I'm reflecting on Hobgoblin here, Hobgoblin has a very, very obvious rock, paper, scissors thing where literally every unit has a little row of numbers which say how rocky or how papery they are compared to this unit's scissors. And once you get into combat, that is a useful and functional resolution mechanic, but it's much more interesting prior to combat, where you're making decisions about where to push your forces. What can happen is that you could, and I quite often go back to Mighty Empires in this regard, like you could have a combat resolution system that asks you to choose stances in some way. So in Mighty Empires, you have 2 entire armies represented by banners, and one has to choose a stance and the other has to choose a stance, and you reveal them. And those 2 things interact in a rock, paper, scissors way to sort of give massive bonuses. And you can imagine, like, although that's 2 armies, you could imagine a very similar system with 2 samurai swordsmen or two duelists or something.
I suppose the point I'm making there is that one of the ways of making your combat system interesting is to make it the answer at the end of the question that was asked by the movement phase. Hopefully all the bits of your game are gonna tie together in some way, and making your combat phase the answer to a question that was asked during deployment and was played out during movement. I mean, it's a sort of a classic joke situation. You've got your setup and you've got your story and you've got your punchline, and there's something satisfying about that. And people enjoy going through that process, enjoy laying out the units during deployment and going, oh, I've got to watch out for that there with my, oh look here, there's his glass cannon, I've got to crack into that quickly with some fast moving troops. And then playing out those questions. And if your combat phase ends up being the answer to that question, it can be very perfunctory. And we were talking before about cutting the combat phase down to the bone, cutting out multiple resolution systems, taking it away from hit, wound, save to 1 dice roll, crack, it's in there. If all the questions that to be answered in the combat phase have been asked throughout the movement phase, asked throughout the deployment phase, maybe your combat phase can be super sharp, 1 dice, just pop it through the eye of the needle and do that, because it's interesting, because it's answered an interesting question you've been asking for the last sort of 20 minutes.
It's interesting. It sort of makes me think of Risk, and like Risk is a board game that has combat in it, and it's not like the combat system is ridiculously simple, but nobody ever like like, oh, nobody ever complains about the lack of complexity in the Risk combat system because so many interesting questions are asked around it.
Yeah. So I think that's one of the ways you make your combat phase interesting is by making it part of a series of interesting decisions. I suppose the point I'm trying to make is you don't necessarily need to have a combat system that's like super cog integrational and carries the whole weight of the game upon its shoulders, and everything else around it is sort of window dressing, and it's all about when these things meet in the middle, and then you get to do all of your super stuff. Sometimes
unless you're writing Mech Warrior or Adeptus Titanicus or something where
yeah, I mean we'll try
you
and
are essentially walking gun platforms.
Yeah. I mean, like I say, there's multiple ways you're going to have to resolve some of these things, but consider stripping it down and making it part of the answer to a question that the whole game's been asking. That's one of the ways of making it interesting, is by making it perfunctory almost. Let's say that. One of the things that makes combat interesting is something called I'm going to call threat identification. A lot of games, especially games that have a lot of complexity to the troops and the army lists and the army list interactions, revolve around a player's ability to threat identify the other side, to be able to understand what the things are that are a problem for them and prioritize dealing with them in the correct order. And it's something that becomes extra saucy interesting when you've got objectives and scenarios and special aims, because suddenly something that's fairly weedy but is good at completing objectives becomes a very high priority target, becomes a bit much bigger threat than the dude with the rocket launcher and the iron claws and the crunchy death crusher. So making it interesting, making it non-trivial for your players to pick the thing that they are going to attack, and making that a layered process for them that they can identify back and forth, is again a way of inherently making your combat system interesting without needing to make your combat system itself crunchy and complex and overweighty, let's say. So I think that's partly related to the idea of building pressure points put on a table. And this is something that I think A Billion Suns is super interested in. The nature of the way in which threat ranges of a model build up. I think of it sometimes as like if you see the isobar maps that you get on the weather on the news, there's this sort of invisible set of hills and valleys on the tabletop. And when you have models with threat ranges dotted around the tabletop, suddenly there's a set of invisible fields and auras and bumps and lumps and lanes and tracks on the tabletop. And these are
pressure, you will.
A topology of death upon the tabletop. And where those pressure points are, where they focus, where they concentrate, what they concentrate on, what they control access to, that's inherently interesting again. And again, it's a way of the combat itself. The death that happens can be a single dice that just blows someone's head off, with a single shot, and it's dead simple. But the biggest way that you can make combat, the rolling of the dice to kill someone, interesting again there, is to make when the dice are going to be rolled, what they're going to be rolled at, why someone's going to risk running through the lane of fire to get to the other point, how juicy what's on the far side is, how risky it is to get there, whether it's worth sacrificing something. And then right away, players have got a sort of, okay, I can risk 5 people rushing the guns there. He's got 4 bullets in his gun. I'm pretty sure I counted them, and I feel lucky. These are ways of, again, putting interest into a combat phase by building up interest throughout the rest of your game. And the last part of that sort of making your combat phase interesting by building up the game around it, I would say, is movement direction within your game. Your movement phase is often going to be a very important part of your of the game. It's going to define the lanes of fire in your shooting game. It's going to define when units get double hit in close combat. It's going to define where you catch somebody in a flank or rear. By giving bonuses dependent upon what you're charging from, where you're charging to, where you're hitting somebody, you build a synergy between the combat phase and the movement phase that doubles the interest of both of those phases. It's a virtuous circle, and as few simple relations between the two can exponentially increase the interest in each of them. So those are a few of the ways I think that you can make your combat phase interesting by building up the interest in the way within the game and the way it relates to the combat phase, back and forth across each other. Mike, I know that you have strong opinions on resolution of a combat phase itself and unusual forms of resolution.
Well, I think it's worth getting the paper clips out and taking an inventory of them. So having written the aforementioned 87 combat systems, I suppose there's a bunch of different things that I've cycled through, and I guess I'll just throw these down here in terms of things that you can consider and cycle through yourself as you're trying to find the right mesh of mechanical resolution systems for the thing that you're trying to describe on the table. So, like, very simply, I can be rolling a dice against some kind of target number, and that target number can be a static target number, or it can be a target number affected by either the modifiers of terrain and whatnot, or the stats of the opposing model. I can also have a stat comparison. So I might have a statistic about attacking, and you might have a statistic about defending, and the interplay of those two stats. You know, old school games have that very literally as a table of X, Y, where, you know, you look up my stat and your stat and you get a target number or something, or a dice pool. And I suppose that's the third thing is, you can roll one dice, or you can roll a pool of dice. And
dice.
Yeah, and so dice
pool
pool mechanics are, I think, quite interesting, because even in a small scale skirmish game where you're not dealing with, you know, 30 skeletons all rolling one dice, I have found messing about with dice pool systems where you roll like 2, 3, maybe up to 8 or 9 dice, then they provide two things. One is they stabilize the probability curves of your dice, and the other is that they give you a range of results so that you can play with, okay, what happens if I get one result? What happens if I get 4 results? And is that a way that I can instantly have a damage or a wound mechanic that's emergent from a simple dice pool rolling? And then another element that you can consider is whether or not you're having opposed dice rolls, and this can be a single dice, or it can be a pool of dice, or whatever the mechanical resolution is. But opposed dice rolls you'll see in Frostgrave or Infinity are two that come to mind, where we both roll a dice at the same time, and then we even compare the dice and find out, was mine higher, by how much was it higher? And so in the interplay between those two dice, you get a spread of results and something emerges. It's interesting because both Frostgrave and Infinity use a D20, which I find as a designer quite interesting, because that provides a monstrous spread of potential differentials between the rolls, which you have to think about. Because if you just use 2d6s, there would be a very small differential of possible rolls, and that also asks some different questions about how you think about the design.
Yeah. If you want to deal with the probabilities of rolling 2d20s and adding them together, then you're a hero.
Yeah. And then I suppose, like, from that comes, like, the funny dice are also available to you. So I grew up with, you know, Traveller and role-playing games where, you know, I never played D&D, but role-playing games where lots of dice are available to you to throw in different scenarios based on different conditions and so forth. And I think that a lot of tabletop miniature skirmish games have defaulted to D6s because we've all got lots of them lying around. And I think that looking at other shaped dice is both great from a design standpoint and kind of problematic, because if your game asks for 12 D12s, I am literally the only person in the south of Great Britain with 12 D12s. I have learned. they're also surprisingly difficult to buy in anything more than ones, even on eBay. But then, okay, so then we've covered a lot of different dice possibilities there. I think there's also the obvious one is cards, because they are another randomizing thing, which we talk a lot about Malifaux, and that kind of introduced me to the idea of, oh, maybe you can use something other than dice. And I'm certain that there are many other like randomizing formats that I have not correctly used. I'm extremely inspired by a role-playing supplement called Whether the Cuckoo Likes for Over the Edge, which was written by Robin D. Laws. And in that, he says, cut up a load of newspaper headlines, put them into a bag, and then pull out words. And then the resolution system in that, which wouldn't work in a skirmish game, is you have to create a convincing sentence out of the words that you've pulled out.
There's a funny, almost becoming a subgenre of RPGs now based around Jenga towers.
Right. Yeah. So the Jenga towers.
Resolutions.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah. And I've got a box of dominoes sat on my shelf because I want to use dominoes for random combat resolution.
That would be good as well. Those would work. My absolute favorite combat resolution system, which I'm not sure if I brought up on this podcast before, is a game called Caveman ! Which is about 3 pages long and available on War Games Vault. In that, you must take pieces of paper and screw them up, and then you must stand on the other side of the table and attempt to hit the opposing player's models with a bit of rolled up paper. And if you do, then you have successfully hit the opposing caveman with a rock and you score a hit. That's a little bit party game, but I do love it.
I mean, that tracks right back to it, because H.G. Wells has been mentioned previously in our comment section, and that's right back there in the original old days of the original wargaming. So you're harking back to a fine tradition there.
And then I think that one of the things that I have experimented with myself, so there's a game that I don't think is available to download at the moment, but it's called Bug Planet, and it's attempting to be a fast play skirmish game. And it was based on this idea that I heard on the Games Design podcast with Will Hindmarsh and Nathan Paletto, where they talked about a role-playing game I haven't played, where the question that the combat system asked was not, do I kill the aliens, but how many aliens do I kill? And that phrase became very interesting to me as a war game designer. I was thinking, okay, it's not do I kill the alien, it's how many aliens do I kill? And so that led to an interesting design process that sort of unpacked into a deck of cards which triggers a dice pool system. And so I was using both cards as activation / sort of stat modifiers and a dice pool system as well. So that isn't a particularly finished system, but I suppose I bring it up to illustrate that all of these points can be combined in lots of different ways. And then I suppose the final part of this info dump on combat resolution mechanical elements or spices that you can add into your broth. The other I think that's really important is control. So as the active player or as the defending player, do I have some resources, some mechanism to re-roll dice or hold results from earlier in the game and introduce them later, or spend a result to make things more difficult for you or more easy for me? And I think that any resolution system that doesn't have a resource management thing, like it needs to, I think it's really worth thinking, like, why aren't I introducing control into the moment of resolution? Because we talked about how if I roll dice and you just immediately have to take toys off without having any kind of saving throw, that can be quite a disheartening experience. One thing that I haven't experimented with, which I'd like to, is what if I can eliminate the back half of that, the second half of that conversation, but by giving control to the other player to affect the dice rolls, maybe that's enough for me to feel like I've got some two-way involvement in the combat resolution. So I think, yeah, introducing controls, whether that's a mechanism to get re-rolls or a mechanism to spend to get more or less on the other person. Anyway, there's my brief topology of death summary.
I think one thing
we should definitely change the podcast name to Topologies of Death, though.
Topologies of Death.
Yeah.
TOPD. I think one of the things, one of the more overarching ideas to come back to is look at what it is that you're trying to write a game about. Ask yourself why you're trying to write a game about that, and figure out how to do that within your combat phase. And those might sound like quite obvious things, but again, one of the little games I've got up free to download is a game of pirate-based combat on a boat, and I wanted to write that because I like the idea of a fighting on a dynamic system. A boat is moving from side to side. Some things aren't going to be fixed down. They're going to come swinging across and mash you into the, if there's a massive crate coming swinging at you, that's probably more dangerous than the dude is about to punch you in the face anyway.
And in the movies, it's always incredibly exciting when the hero is like ingeniously using the emerging environments to like leap off something and surprise them from above because they're
I watched the first episode of Black Sails, and there's an incredibly brutal combat, ship-to-ship combat in that, and I was like, I want that somewhere. That's brilliant. But the point is, because of that that story that I'm trying to tell there, that system has an option for hitting somebody or for tripping them. Because once somebody's tripped and the ship shifts, then they're sliding across the deck and they're heading towards going overboard, and going overboard is instant death. And if you can affect how the ship is pitching and yawing, or if you can push somebody in a certain direction before tripping them up, you've got a little question of, shall I just stab the guy with my sword, or shall I shove him over there and then my friend will catch him, trip him up, and then when the ship pitches at the end of the turn, he's going to go skidding overboard, and that'll be better than stabbing him twice. So you've inherently got a little question there that's answered by virtue of the fact that you're writing a game about pirates fighting on a pirate ship.
I think there's also an important point there, which is you've made a decision that it should be cool and rewarding to decide, I'm not going to kick this guy in the testicles twice. I'm going to trip him up and shove him in that direction, because and then that gives you a really solid basis to say, okay, how many wounds should people have and how much damage should weapons do? Because I need to make sure that it is more effective to do the thing that's cinematically cool, because if it's always obviously better just to kick the guy twice in his ribs, then that's what you'll do, and you won't get the emergent cinematic moments you're looking for.
I mean, a great, I think, game in relation to this is if you look at the previous edition and current edition of Carnival. Because I remember picking up I think it was the first edition of Carnival and going, oh, this is so exciting! I can wall run and I could do this and could do the other. And then you actually read it and you were like, but it's always a bad idea to wall run. It's always risky. It's more risk. It's just better to just walk over and stab the guy. And now in the new system, they've gone, right. Being cool is cool and fantastic and give you juicy, swizzy goodness in return for being cool. So look at what it is that you're trying to create. Ask why it doesn't. If you're trying to write it, I assume it doesn't already exist for you. Otherwise, just play the thing that already exists. If it doesn't already exist for you, ask what it is that doesn't already exist. Ask what it is you're trying to recreate. And there's probably something interesting right there that doesn't exist. Figure out how to make it happen, and you'll probably already therefore have an interesting combat phase built in for you, because you're answering interesting questions that people want to see answered. Yeah, that's a conversation ending statement.
Nice. Yes, I have nothing further to say. Yeah, combat phases. Roll some d6, people. Great.
Make them tell us.
Well, righto.
Yeah. So hopefully you enjoyed that conversation from the two of us. If you did, like and subscribe. If you didn't, tell us what you didn't like about it. Drop us a comment. We can improve. We can make things better. Either way, drop us a comment. Let us know what you'd like to see us talk about in the future. This whole conversation was inspired by a comment from one of our watchers. So you too can have your hopes and dreams spoken about by two random people on YouTube, if you should so decide.
Internet, what a glorious thing.
If you are watching this as a video, it's also available as a podcast for longer painting sessions. If you're listening to it as a podcast, it's also available on YouTube, where you can look upon our faces and see us for real. Please drop us a comment. Please like and subscribe. Please find us on social media. There's a set of links below this where you can berate us personally at our homes and offices. But until then, and until the next conversation, I think it's going to be goodbye.
Ta-ta.
Bye from me. Bye.